everybody, welcome to this Google Hangout for the IACCM Commercial Contract Management MOOC in conjunction with FutureLearn. Welcome to my guests as well, the experts who are going to be speaking with us today. Our topic is contracts and digitisation. And I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Cummins, who's the CEO of IACCM, a veritable thought leader in this space. And I know that you will all benefit hugely from hearing what he's got to say about this. I'm also joined by Kingsley Martin. And Kingsley is the CEO and founder of a company called KM Standards, a technology company that's really a leading light in this field at the moment. And Kingsley is a lawyer by background, both Harvard and Oxford educated, no less, and actually amazingly taught himself how to code as well. So, you know, really pretty expert when it comes to talking about contracts and digitisation. We also were hoping to be joined by another colleague, Kai Jakob, who's the VP of Global Legal Information Management at SAP. Kai, unfortunately, is having a few challenges, technical challenges, getting onto the Hangout today. So hopefully he'll join us shortly. So without further ado, Tim, I'm going to start bringing you into the conversation, please. So I suspect there's a few people out there who would say contracts, digitization, somewhat of an oxymoron. Contracts are paper documents. They always have been, they always will be. How can we really reconcile digitizing contracts? So what is it that we mean by it, and how are we faring in this field at the moment?
Yeah, thank you, Sally. Well, probably in beginning on that particular response, it's worthwhile just pointing out what digital is. I mean, what is digital as opposed to something else? And of course, digital is used in the context of a comparison with the analog world. And I suppose the simplest view of digital is it really is the joining together of what are traditionally different technologies, the audio component, the video component. And so we're beginning to see more and more of a conjunction. And of course, all of us are very aware of that really in our daily lives as we're operating, you know, increasingly with our mobile devices, with the capacity now to be having a phone call. Yeah, choice to your point, in a written form, although of course for many of us as consumers we really have already gone beyond that, because how many times a day do we do the click here?
Yes.
Without even reading those terms and conditions, let alone printing them off and storing them somewhere. So, so to that extent, we've already moved to a digital world of contracts. I think the big and interesting question we're going to be touching on more today is, well, just how far can that go? And you know, just this week, in fact, I had a note from one of our members saying, how many instances have we come across of digital purchase orders, click agreements for purchase ordering? And certainly, if you think about the ways that we operate with online buying services like Amazon or Alibaba, you know, we're already, again, moved into a digital contracting world. At the consumer level, I think that's fairly easy to understand. When you start to get to the business-to-business level, that it becomes a little bit more, in a way, mind-boggling, because there, of course, we're often familiar with, well, what about negotiation? We're going to do digital negotiations then? And of course, the answer is increasingly, yes, we do. Many negotiations today really are conducted using video conferencing. It's a confluence, you know, we're using email, we're using video. And so moving forward, it does raise some fascinating questions. I think, Sally, you're aware, one of the questions that was posed to us at one point by the UK government was, could we create virtual reality contracts? So a contract and a set of terms that essentially somebody could walk through. A project manager could go in as an avatar and ask questions like, what happens if I decide not to pay my bill? And I think we will see this massive simplification of what today is complex, but unnecessarily complex. People are intimidated by contracts today. We have to make them more user-friendly.
Yes, and of course, you're absolutely right that in the consumer world and business-to-consumer environment, we're very much further ahead in terms of digitizing contracts. But as you've touched on, Tim, the business-to-business environment is, well, would you say it's very behind? We still see a lot of thick paper contracts being sent across from one organization to another. So, how far behind is the business-to-business environment in this space?
Well, I think this takes us to perhaps the next point of definition, which is digitization as opposed to digitalization. As if it isn't complicated enough, let's just have a minor couple of letters stuck in the middle and create a completely different meaning. So digitizing a contract means simply coding it so that it is computer code rather than this written document. And certainly Kingsley will be able to comment on that much more proficiently than I. Digitalization, on the other hand, is looking at a business process and turning that into a more consistent and coherent digital form. That is, I think, where we're seeing the particular problem with contracting. Contracts in the business environment particularly are well, the process through which they are formed and managed is a relatively complicated one. It involves a multitude of different groups, people in the organization. Many of them have power and authority over different components of that process. And unless the process itself is turned into a digital form, then simply taking one component of the process, I think we had an example recently where somebody commented to us that they had digitized the contract and tried to simplify from a pure contract perspective, and everybody else who was involved in the process was up in arms because from their perspective it had actually made the whole thing a lot more complicated. So I'm sure Kingsley would have some views on this, but certainly as we look at the total end-to-end process of contracting, that is a long way from getting digitalized.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And Kingsley, let me bring you in. You have tremendous expertise as far as the technology in this space is concerned. So what are we really seeing in terms of technology? How is it beginning to impact the contracting process and contracting generally?
If I may go back to the definitions.
Yes.
When we talk about digital contracts, I mean, at some level of definition, we've had digital contracts for some time. I mean, starting with the IBM Selectric. And certainly as we move into the PC, we create and store contracts in a digital form. But of course, they are fundamentally words. Now, we can put them into video format, but I think that the word form of a contract will be around for some time. In fact, I often think of contracts as the language of business, how we actually document our business relationships. Now, we can move anywhere along a continuum from drafting contracts in sort of a very Prosian form, high legalese, all the way through to drafting them in machine code. But I think there is significant benefit from not only having the machine be able to read it, but also have humans being able to read it. So words will continue. In fact, what we're trying to do is essentially quantify those words, move it from the sort of highly nuanced and subjective worlds of today so that we can, in fact, understand and be able to interpret them using technology. And that process was laid out and by many businesses, and notably by Richard Susskind, in a four-stage process that we move from today's one-off or bespoke in English terms to standardize, to systematize, to package, and ultimately commoditized. And I think that in that sort of that very first step, we see then what we need to do next. We need to move from the one-off to the standards. I think there's wide-scale understanding that that's important, but certainly an enormous amount of resistance. We've always written it this way, that I need to customize this contract, every single contract, to the particular nuances of the transaction, and it is inhibiting us from taking advantage of the full capability. A bit like building an assembly line for cars and sending down components that each piece is different, and we've got to find a way to connect them. This has to happen first, and then from there, we can go on and talk about all of the next steps, in terms of simplification, modularizing and reusing it, and using this capability to connect and integrate platforms to be able to get the full benefit. So I think we started the journey. One of the things that I'm actually grateful for is the hype around AI. I mean, it may be clearly it's overblown, but it's at least getting some serious interest in this space, and we'll see many sort of directions that come out of it. But I suspect that standards.
And of course, building on the AI point, Kingsley, the similar debates over blockchain, where we are beginning the active implementation of contracts. And of course, this drives us to what at least we consider such an important point, Sally, around people understanding that contracts fundamentally are economic assets. Yeah. They're not legal instruments, they're economic assets. Yeah. You can trade in them. They lie at the heart of a business's success. If it has no contracts, there probably isn't a business. So from that perspective, the move towards the ledger-based blockchain system is, I think, a particularly interesting one. And of course, it's in that context that people often are also talking about smart contracts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think, and Kingsley, I wanted to sort of pose this to you as well, that, and to both of you, that there's so much technology out there now, and absolutely, Tim, you've just touched on it. Kingsley was talking about artificial intelligence. You've mentioned blockchain. So we're presented with all of that wonderful technology, yet we have certainly a key group of people, not least the lawyers, who feel very threatened by the technology. As you've mentioned, Kingsley, we bespoke everything as lawyers. We care about the artisanal approach, the fact that things need to be done differently every time, because that's what we've been trained to do. So, how do we marry that difference? How do we overcome that challenge?
I mean, things are clearly changing, and we will need different approaches. It's not necessary to say that we're just, all folks today working on this will be replaced by machines. I think the big transition that's happening is the move from the one to the many. From drafting that one and customizing that one contract to being able to manage portfolios of contracts. And there's going to be a huge amount of effort and labor and work that comes out of that. I mean, just building on what Tim was said in terms of the blockchain. When we move from words to apps, one of the first steps, we're going to essentially take some of these processes and turn them into applications. And one key piece of that, of course, is the payment component of the contract. But there are others too. I could build in an app around insurance, title insurance, escrow insurance. I can build apps around compliance, being able to check contracts for security, data privacy, etc. So I think all of that capability is an enormous amount of work that's yet to be undertaken, and an enormous opportunity for today's lawyers, today's technologists, as we marry the two professions of law and technology. I don't think we have moved from the farm to the factory to the office. I think the similar transition is going to happen. It's going to be different. It may employ people with different skills, but I think it's not going to change the size and scope of the business as a whole. It may even be bigger as we start to build these large-scale systems that we can manage and monitor and be able to essentially track and optimize using the technology, which we can't do today. Every contract not only is bespoke written, it has to be manually reviewed. And if we could bring them together, I can't imagine all the opportunities that will come out of it and all the people that it will employ.
Yeah, I mean, I think two fundamental areas that we're seeing and excited by there. One is the increase in knowledge, and it's, you know, as one general counsel observed to us recently, my CEO used to respect my opinion, but these days he wants facts.
Yeah.
And facts have been severely lacking, and of course are reflected in exactly what you were talking about, Sally, of my words are better than your words.
Yeah.
Well, prove it. Well, I can't prove it. It's my opinion.
We can't manage what we can't track. If we don't have the information, we are left with that. I mean, I think my contract's better than yours.
So, of course, as we begin to be able to look at portfolios, we'll be able to do an analysis of that sort of thing and say, well, do actual clause combinations or word combinations have an impact on the results? The other side of portfolio that I think is especially interesting is that of a portfolio of interdependent contracts. Yeah. So we begin to look, particularly today, at major projects. So obviously we have a contract with our customer. There may be some interdependent contracts. If it's a major construction project, for example, there may be a teaming agreement. So there may be several contractors with shared responsibility for that delivery. But then underpinning all of that, there will be a whole host of subcontractors, the bricklayers, the masons, the carpenters, etc., etc. Today, all of those are really handled as individual activities. There is no obvious way of conjoining them. And digital technology, of course, will start to give us this ability to have visibility across all of those. And that, to your point about changing the work, Kingsley, means that rather than constant firefighting because we don't know about problems until after they've happened, we're going to start getting much better visibility and being able to anticipate some of the things that are going to wrong and actually focus our work more on solving problems in advance of their arising rather than always reacting.
Well, of course, and the very nature of digitization forces transparency then, and it forces a transparency across the supply chain. So that is, we hope, one of the major consequences of digitization. Some can say it, I'm struggling. Driving transparency across the network. And as we've observed, Tim, you know, we are increasingly working in networked environments as opposed to one-to-one relationships.
And I think that's really as I kind of tracked my career. I mean, I started off in practice doing essentially acquisitions, buying and selling assets and companies. And of course, the parties came together just for that transaction. We could complete it, and in all honesty, we could file that merger agreement away and only revisit it in the hopefully unlikely event of litigation. But as Tim pointed out today, most of our contracts today are very interdependent service nature contracts, MOUs, memorandums of understandings that bleed into master service agreements that have underlying it many, many SOWs and amendments. And we can't just simply file the document and say the contract at the end of that and say, well, we're done. That will take care of itself. In fact, there's an enormous number of obligations that need to be tracked out of it. Another example of managing the portfolio is that post-contract, post-signature efforts are now much more significant than they ever used to be. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunities in optimizing contracts is going to come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we are seeing organizations implement that technology to support obligation extraction in those complex agreements and disseminate those obligations efficiently through the organization and through the supply chain as well. So yes, I mean, absolutely. I think we've got a question that's just come in, and in fact, my apologies to everybody, because I did mean to say to you at the very beginning, if you do have questions, please do pose them. So, however, we've got our first one. It's interesting, in an ever-evolving world, is there an ability, or will there ever be the ability, to create or agree a contract over a messaging function, such as WhatsApp, or a call function such as Skype? Well, going back into my legal training, I think we're already in a place where absolutely you could create a contract over WhatsApp if you've got a record, and you can create contracts verbally as well. So, you know, indeed, the technology is allowing us to create contracts in an ever-evolving way.
No, that's absolutely right, Sally. In fact, there are some contract management software applications, Aptors, who we were talking to yesterday, have the embedded capability to build a store and record of communication via social media. So if you're perhaps agreeing or discussing a major amendment to the contract using instant messenger, then that will go into the contract record. And of course, we've seen plenty of evidence of the courts being only too ready to take any of these social media activities into consideration in reaching judgment.
Yeah.
One of the other pieces of that puzzle is that I can foresee that too. I mean, essentially, we could do it over a relatively simplified application, WhatsApp or Skype, provided we have simple modular contracts. Perhaps in the future, you know, we will actually do all contracts and even contract negotiation through a term sheet. Simply check the boxes, put in the business terms, the names, the dates, the amounts, and then, you know, if we need a non-compete and non-solicitation, we've got a nice library of them. Everyone knows what they say. They're written clearly. We'll just bring them in as we need. We'll build a contract that way.
Absolutely. Since it is obviously the principles, it's the question of, you know, is payment due in 30 days, 45 days, 60 days? Is it due on receipt of invoice or on acceptance of the product? You know, these are the things that matter, not the specific words, which today absorb so much time. And of course, I think fundamental here, Sally, is the point that businesses are digitizing in a bigger context. They have to in order to compete. New startup businesses don't have the complexity of the large corporation with all of its different competing functions and all of its complex software systems that were designed for a completely different era. So big corporates as well, if they're going to survive, are going to have to adjust rapidly towards this digital world. And in doing that, of course, to the point you've been making, Kingsley, the archaic medieval approach to contracts is going to become more and more obvious as an impediment to digitization.
And sorry,
that's going to answer the question too. But I think you are also.
I want to pick up on this question that's come in, because it's a very, very important one for us to address. One of the questions is, how do we equip our legal business advisors to think effectively and digitally about the use of future technologies? And I think, you know, it's well, Kingsley, what are your thoughts?
Well, how do we equip them? I think obviously through education, through the work of, you know, like the IACCM, to show possibilities. And then one of the things that, you know, we've discussed is that one of the challenges we face today is the enormous array of technology that's available. Yes. For those of us that have, you know, essentially spent our lives working on it, maybe we have some means to be able to navigate that an enormous set of possibilities. And then one of the things I think we can do as a group is, you know, be able to organize and help people understand what's available, what it can do, and I think just as importantly, what it's not equipped to do. Yeah, so I think it's primarily education. It's also incumbent on the technologists, to essentially make it more accessible and easy to use. Yeah, we haven't done that so well.
No, I think that's right, and just building on that, Kingsley, you know, the technology landscape is very confusing at the moment, and absolutely, Thank you, Kingsley, because that is why one of the reasons why ICCM is here, to help its members navigate that complexity. And I think what's also really important is taking away the fear factor, because I think there's a real sense, particularly amongst the legal advisors, the lawyers, that machines and Richard and Daniel Susskind have written about this and probably encourage that fear, but there's a sense that machines are going to be replacing me, and I think it's really important to temper that with, in fact, what the technology can do is really enhance your role and allow you to get away from a lot of the repetitive activity and be more creative, be more efficient, and be more valuable to your organization. So I think it's sort of important to encourage that message that actually, if I was a general counsel in an organization now, I'd be desperate to implement the technology to help me to become ever better at what I do.
I think, yes, I think the points both of you have made are really important. To be fair, we are seeing quite a number of lawyers who really are showing great leadership in this.
Yes.
Both of you are lawyers and you're both sitting here talking about it, so clearly this isn't universal. And for those who are in big corporations, yeah, I'm sure there are some in the legal department who absolutely feel intimidated. It seems alien. They don't like using technology. They would really rather have a personal assistant to do their emails as well. And, there are always, in every era of human development, there are those who are enthusiastic about change, and there's those who feel somewhat skeptical or concerned about it, and those who downright oppose it. The important point is, I suppose, to go out and look for allies within your legal department. And I think the key point that's just been made is the one that says, give people examples, show them that this is not about being irresponsible and taking ridiculous risks. It's actually about enabling the business to operate differently and more intelligently. And, given the extent of importance that contracts have as assets, given the volume of important information they contain, it is essential that people can actually understand them and easily use them. And today, the process is not one that people understand or use. So I think we also need to help our legal departments understand that the traditional way of doing things is risky.
Yeah. There's a great question here around examples. Is the panel aware of and prepared to share any examples of organizations that are leading the way in terms of best practice CLM digitization? There are lots of examples, and I think Tim, a couple that we would share and certainly were showcased at our recent conference in Europe are British Telecom with their implementation of a system called Raven, which is supporting obligation extraction, and also Vodafone, who have implemented Syrian Labs to support on their procurement side. Kingsley, I'm sure you've probably got some examples of organizations that you're specifically working with as KM Standards as well.
Yeah, there are a number, and a lot of them are the ones that we're working with. They're doing a lot of contract streamlining and simplification. And there I would highlight one, GE Aviation, that publicly reported the results of their efforts. It's in there, you can Google it. The link you can find by Honey, I Shrunk the Contract. They took a 50-plus page MSA and shortened it to less than 10 pages, I think something in the order of 7. Of course, their first reaction from the lawyers is, so what did you miss?
Yeah.
What did you leave out? The answer was nothing. The benefits were also published in that article, saying that they reduced contract negotiation time by 60%. While they haven't tracked this yet, I suspect you'll see the same reduction in time required to administer the contract, and probably a significant reduction around any issues that may result in litigation. It's a very clear, plain contract. So a lot of that work is going on. HPE and Microsoft and others have led that kind of work. So that's really what Richard Sussman's pointing out. Step one, streamline, standardize. And these are some of the leading firms that are doing just that.
And of course, it's important, again, to go back to the point that it is about digitalizing the process, not just the document.
Absolutely.
And so we have examples like Nexen, that was one of our Contract Excellence Award winners in our European conference, which looked at how do you make contracts or design the contracting process to be fit for the user community. And in this case, you'll know, Sally, it was the sort of native tribes here in Canada, where Nexen wanted to be able to employ and build trust and confidence in its activities in employing the native tribes more holistically in a lot of its projects. But they were intimidated, not just by the contract, but actually by the whole bidding and RFX process. Yeah. So this wasn't just a question of simplifying the contract. You needed to look at the entire activity and make it more user-friendly, that you know, build trust rather than undermine trust. Because of course, most of us, when we see a traditional contract or traditional heavy bid documentation, the last thing it does is induce trust.
Yeah, absolutely. The questions are coming in thick and fast at the moment, and I really do want to pick up on some of them because they're very important. So question, I do have concerns to raise over digital security, such as recent hacking of banks, security services, and in the UK, the NHS systems ring alarm bells. I'd like to hear the participants' views on this matter. So as Kingsley, as we move into a world of digital contracts, you know, do we have a sense that they're less secure than their paper colleagues?
Well, certainly something we must handle, and we must make this as secure as possible. So obviously, it's a very difficult thing to do to get 100% security guarantees. Now, in my career, the biggest breaches that I've seen have all been inside jobs. The first one was essentially a group of people stealing paper. They had the names of the target companies written out that were supposed to be secure, that were taken from a partner's desk. And the group made millions of dollars trading them. It was Stockwatch that found them. Of course, all the recent, you know, big security breaches, including, you know, Snowden, again, were inside jobs. These are the things that we have to look at it holistically. The digital security piece is an important component of it. And the encryption capability and, you know, certification to ISO 27001 will go a long way to do that if people do it. Even the recent one were essentially unpatched Windows 7 environments. We need to do better. We have the standards to do it. We need to apply them, but in many cases, it's a very complicated matter. And I think it's even FedEx was one of the guilty parties still using unpatched Windows 7 that, you know, made their systems open. So it's not perfect, but I think we have a better chance of securing it digitally than we do physically.
Well, and I think that was, yes, absolutely, the sort of the point I wanted to make was we have opportunities to be far more secure in our digital environment than we ever had in our paper-based world. But I think you raise a really important point, Kingsley, and that is about, you know, when you're thinking about implementing a technology and working with an organization, you need to do your homework, and you need to ask all the right questions. You need to have that level of expertise within your own organization to be asking those challenging questions about the levels of security that exist within that organization. You know, are they ISO 27001 certified, for example? That's a simple question. But those are all going to be incredibly important as technology is implemented.
Yeah, there was actually a great article yesterday that was making the point that one of the least secure segments of industry today when it comes to cybersecurity is the law firms. In fact, if anybody's interested, drop me an email and I'll get the article across to you. But it was actually fascinating. I think to net that down, the point was being made was that if you're not thinking of a digitalized process, then you don't think of coherent security for that process. So, for anybody who says, oh, digital is risky, well, you're telling me that you never email documents around the place and that you don't have some of those contracts stored in your email? Or don't you ever actually commit them into Word and perhaps put them up onto some sort of shared drive? These are the fundamental areas that today are being hacked. It's that area that is the greatest weakness. So if you think this is going to be less secure, then I think that's a fundamental failure to appreciate just how insecure today's methods are.
Yeah. So a quick question relating to GDPR. I'm just going to take 2 more questions because I'm very conscious that then we need to wrap up. But question for those of us in Europe, we have GDPR. Yes, these are the new data protection regulations. And in fact, whilst they're European regulations, they have global implication. Any perspective on managing this with contractors and digital approaches to consider would be welcomed, bearing in mind we need to demonstrate permission for gathering data, justify why we're gathering, and ensure compliant disposal within the timescales. This is going to be significant and probably underestimated. It is a massive area and probably not something that we can effectively deal with in a sort of 30-second response, but certainly GDPR is high on the radar of many organizations. It's certainly a topic that our members are wanting to talk about. So here at IACCM, we are going to be really tackling this question of GDPR, its implication as far as the contracting process and supply chain is concerned. So I think, from my perspective, I would probably say, watch this space. It's a really, really important topic and one that we will continue to support our members with. And Kingsley, I don't know whether you have any comment briefly.
Well, it's interesting. Actually, this is where I wear my 2 hats. So it just so happens this week that I've been working with a lot of corporations to define data security and data protection standards in contractual terms.
Right.
But I'm also at the same time attempting to code the ability to identify personal identified information, names, companies, addresses, fax numbers, so that we can first start off and get a handle of what protected data there is in a document. I have to tell you, it's extremely difficult, and I don't think it's something that even in the near term we can handle with the 100% accuracy.
No.
But again, we can mitigate our risk.
Yeah.
And I think we can either just sort of say, oh, it can't be done, we'll just put this in a lockbox and no one can get to it. Or essentially, the other side of it is essentially minimize. And that's where the technology can come in. And if we increment or add to that some human review, I think we can go a long way to understanding what sensitive data is in a data set.
Yeah, great.
And of course, Sally, is a topic, as you said, that we are tackling. We have a community of interest activity going on this. We will be running a number of expert webinars over the next couple of months. So certainly if our questioner or others listening in are IACCM members, you'll get notification about that automatically. And if you're not, then please do go to our site. You can sign up even as a guest member, and at least then you'll be alerted to the initiatives that we have going on in this area.
Yeah, so final question, which I think is a really nice way to wrap up our conversation today. What are the panel's thoughts on contract management becoming automated? Do they believe the human element is fundamental and will always be required or not?
Yes, it will always be required. But the difference is that today, so we move from this bespoke or one-off to futures more standard, more systematized. There will always be a need for exception handling. There will always be the need for the creative, the things that haven't been done before, the gray areas in between. It's just going to narrow, but we'll probably identify more of those examples, and the questions that are left are going to be really hard, that only humans can really answer. So now there's always going to be a need for that. We're never going to completely close the gap.
The machines can certainly undertake tremendous analysis, and they can give us access to information and data that we have never had before. What they will not be able to do, at least right now, is exercise judgment. So to the extent that contract management is an automatable discipline, and obviously basic tracking of milestones, of sending out communications, ensuring that somebody's got their insurance policy in place, you know, that sort of stuff quite obviously can be taken over and should be taken over by machines. Mm-hmm. It's as you begin to get these fascinating new areas of data that are generated that we can begin to apply new and distinctive thought. And, you know, so many of the executives we talk to, Sally, as you know, are talking more and more about the need for commercial innovation to move forward faster and faster. And contracting is going to give people more and more in-depth insights. It's such a virgin territory. It's an unexplored land that has essentially up till now just been handled through these individualistic activities made complex because of the lack of technology. Technology is going to transform our knowledge and our abilities. It's a fascinating area to be in right now. Well,
and made complex through this bespoke nature of contracting up till now, and I think that's again where, you know, we can just start to see major change and huge efficiencies and transparency, all of those things that we've been talking about. Kingsley, Tim, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I'm sorry to the audience that our third panelist, Kai, was not able to make it. But it's been a fascinating conversation. This is an area that is really evolving at a dramatic pace at the moment. So lots more to come. We look forward to chatting to you all again in our Hangout next Thursday. And in the meantime, continue enjoying the course. Thank you, Kingsley. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Sally.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.